Hi. It's 1 o'clock sharp, and given that we have a lot of things to talk about, let us try to be punctual. Welcome to the panel with this colorful title of How I Learned to Love the Bomb, or let us discuss the Japanese perception of World War II in their pop culture, such as manga, anime, and movie franchises. Before we begin, a couple of disclaimers. First thing first, you're going to see some stuff that is a bit disturbing, so to say. We're going to talk about some things that are not really nice when it comes to Japan, but as with any other country, it's important if we admire their culture also to be aware of their dark side. That said, this is not for kiddies. Do you follow? The second thing is that actually I'm not a professional historian, I'm just an enthusiast, which means that this is work of a very, very passionate amateur. That said, here the challenge was how to go through tons of historical sources and discern and select what is actually interesting for me and for us. And if you want to learn more about this, I guess that the only thing you need to do is switch on the History Channel, because the Pacific War is basically one of the only topics they are showing in between storage wars and porn stars. And the third disclaimer is we're going to talk about World War II not from the military history point of view. So we ain't going to talk about strategy, we ain't going to talk about tactics, we ain't going to talk about battles. We will talk about the phenomenology of the war. And for that purpose, we're going to focus on two events that marked the Pacific theater. One is the Nanking Massacre, and the other is, of course, the bomb. Are we clear? Are we on the same page? Yay. So we begin with the history part of this all before we go to pop culture. So with history, I have a fun fact for you. This is not the Hiroshima bomb. When you Google the atomic bomb, usually you see this picture, but this picture is actually from the tests from Arizona. The real photo of the Hiroshima bombing is not so vivid, but we will get to that part. Anyway, when you're thinking you're looking at Hiroshima, you're actually looking at Arizona. To begin explaining how Japan got entangled into the clusterfuck that is the 20s, we have to say something about the Taisho era. Taisho was an emperor that was one of those poor souls that come in between big names and great rulers. His father, Meiji, was the emperor who pushed Japan, to quote Terry Pratchett, into the century of the fruit bat, meaning that he took it out of isolation and turned it into a modern country that became an industrial force and a diplomatic power to be reasoned with. Whereas on the other hand, Hirohito, his son, or Showa, that we will deal with later, came as an emperor in a very interesting moment in time. Taisho was in between. As it often happens with sons of very authoritative fathers, he was a bit of a weak personality. There are plenty of theories that he actually suffered from bipolar disorder, which was a cause for great shame at the court and the reason why he got pushed away. And his era was known as the brief window of semi-democracy in Japan. They had their own version of the 1920s. It was actually pretty interesting to see, especially when it comes to fashion, because they managed to blend the traditional Japanese garments such as kimonos and obis with all the, frilly flapper stuff like beads and tassels. It was really, really very interesting to see. But what happened is that even though it was a moment of freedom, they had a jazz scene, which was pretty awesome. The economic crisis that struck the world in the 1920s had a big consequence on Japan too. And the consequences reflected in a huge drop of economic standard. And as it often happens, who do you blame? Of course, you blame the weak emperor, because he is who he is. And second, you blame the filthy foreigners and their filthy foreign influence. Because what else? So, like in any era of economic poverty, you have a birth of nationalism that leads to populism, that leads to militarism. all coincidences are purely coincidental, of course. The point is that all of a sudden you have very, very strong militarism and militaristic forces in the society. You have Japanese army gaining traction, gaining momentum in such a way that it became a very influential power. And what they managed to do is to take the Bushido, the samurai spirit, and to interpret it in a way that it suited their interests. But we're going to talk about that later. First, let's mention Hirohito as the Emperor Showa, the one who came after Taisho. He was more of his grandfather's grandson than his father's son, but the problem is that militarism in the society was running too deeply for him to do anything. Or as they say, he was a day late and a dollar short to change. And there's a very good line saying about his role in World War II, and that is he knew too much to be innocent, but could do too little to be complicit. And the thing with him is there's a very touching story from Paris when he was a student. He had the opportunity to travel to the Western countries, and he went to Paris as one of his stops on the way, on the tour. And he was thrilled to walk the streets. Why? Because people pushed him. Living as the crown prince in Japan meant that he had a very strict ceremonial role when he was alienated from the people, but being in the street in France when people pushed him and stepped on his toes, that was something amazing. That was, mind-blowing. So they say that he was often, running away from his bodyguards just to walk the crowds and be pushed. So you have that guy who becomes the emperor at a very young age, and you have militarism going rampant. And of course, that is the recipe for this. This is some of the iconography of the Japanese militarism, some of them propaganda posters and materials. You see how everything is going back to the traditional values, how the gender roles are very strict, how you know what is the proper order of the society. These are some of my favorite examples. You see even the ads that were targeting women were very militarized in their iconography, in their messages. You see up there's a Disney ad, which was made long before shit hit the fan and things went south with the States. And below, that is actually the wrap of a pack of cigarettes. But we're not talking about the pack of cigarettes you get in the army. We're talking about the pack of cigarettes you buy on a kiosk, which means how deeply this military iconography ran, because everything was strictly militarized. And education in particular was really following this military style, this patriotism that was imposed. Basically, every college was turned into a military academy of sorts. And of course, all of this gives ideas. And the ideas were the following. The Japanese were the chosen nation in Asia. Why? Because the emperor was the descendant of the goddess of sun. And what does that mean? They should free Asia from colonialism. So their intentions to conquer China and Korea and the rest of the continent were purely noble, of course. What do we have here? On one hand, that is the rhetorics that were passed. On the other hand, we have a very interesting moment of economy and population policy. To continue to develop, Japan needed raw materials. As an island nation, they had serious economic struggles to continue growing their industry. They needed minerals, which they were mostly importing from China, and they needed oil, which they were importing from, guess, United States of America. But also there was another problem, and that is the overpopulation. The islands were getting too crowded too quickly, and they needed to find outlets where they will be able to basically resettle their population. And they saw a very interesting area in China called Manchuria. Now, in 1919, after World War I, Japan already got to control some territories in mainland Asia. First and foremost, Korea, and then also South Manchuria, which is like a tiny piece of actual Manchuria. But they wanted the whole land. They wanted the whole part of it. So they had this, the Mukden incident. Mukden is a small town on the Manchurian border. And the official tale is that filthy Chinese terrorists attacked the innocent and defenseless Japanese army, which was situated on the border, by blowing up the railway. Do you see this picture here? You see this? This is how they blew up the railway. The story has it that actually 15 minutes later, a train crossed the railway without noticing that something was wrong. But still, the Japanese made such a fuss about it that this was a very good excuse to actually attack China. So this is one of the crucial incidents in the intro, in the prelude to World War II. And why it's so important? Because it is very well documented that there were never any Chinese terrorists involved. It was a setup by the Japanese army who blew up the railway so that they could have an excuse to actually invade Manchuria. This is how the state of Manchukuo was created. Now, to understand things a little bit better, we have to know what's going on in China at the moment. China in the early 1930s is a bloody clusterfuck. It's not the China that we know and like. It is a country where you have a very serious civil war going on. You have two main forces. One is the Kuomintang, the nationalists, which are led by Chiang Kai-shek. The other is the CCP, the communists, which are led by Comrade Mao. They have successfully dethroned their last emperor from the Qing dynasty, and they are, trying to kick each other's asses. So when the Japanese invade China, invade Manchuria at the moment, they had a very, handy situation. They could basically just pluck the dethroned emperor and enthrone him now in Manchuria and say this is a legal Chinese country because it has the Chinese emperor. If you haven't seen the movie The Last Emperor of China by Bernardo Bertolucci, I absolutely recommend it to you because it's pretty awesome in the way it analyzes the downfall of the Manchukuo state and the relations between the Chinese and the Japanese. But Manchukuo, as such, as the puppet state, was a very good foundation, a very good, like a base, like a fortress for the future operations of the Japanese in Asia. Now, what happens next? For the next 6 years, it is a stalemate. It is festering, putrefying, it's left to its own devices. There are minor incidents, of course, such as, for instance, the bombing of Shanghai in 1932, which was, by the way, a fun fact, the first time that the military air force was used against civilian population with a heavy bombing. But it is as it is until a moment in 1937 when there is another terrorist incident when a bridge near Beijing was blown to bits. It was called Marco Polo Bridge. This time, the Chinese were indeed behind it, the Kuomintang forces. And the Japanese used it as an excuse to start an invasion of China. Now, what do we have here? I'm actually very proud of managing to find the illustrations for this slide. Here, whoopsie, we go forward. Here, you see this is Manchuria. This is how the country actually looks like. It's very pretty and very picturesque and very rich in ores and minerals. What you have here is a Chinese propaganda war poster calling all volunteers to defend China. And what you have here is the Japanese propaganda war poster calling all volunteers to defend China. Because the Japanese tried to present themselves as the benevolent benefactor in this situation because China was falling apart. So the only thing they did was, to bring some order. Someone has to do that. So the war started. Many say that this should be seen as the real beginning of World War II, more so than what happened later on in Europe. And the Japanese actually progressed very well with their first conquerors. They crushed first Beijing, then Shanghai. The Chinese were withdrawing, among other reasons, because they realized that they want to preserve their forces so that they can fight the other Chinese, not the Japanese. And then they got to a small city named Nanking. Now, a few words about Nanking. When I say a small city, you know, like a small city in China, only 10 million people. Second, it was like the accidental capital of China at the moment because it was never a city of true strategic significance. But given that the rest of China was, you know, all over the place, this was handy enough to be used as the administrative center for a while. And yeah, what happened was that in December 1937, the Chinese didn't really offer any real resistance in Nanking, and the Japanese entered, and then it began. What happened in the 6 weeks between December 37 and January 38 was known as the Rape of Nanking. It is considered to be the most horrific acts of terror against the civilian population on occupied territory in modern history. It is also, when you analyze why it happened, one of the most common reasons that are given was that the Japanese army was horrified by the Chinese. They saw as cowardice, how they were withdrawing, how they didn't resist them, how they were keeping their force to fight the other Chinese instead of defending their country. So it was a clash of cultures between the Japanese extreme patriotism and what they saw as petty tacticianing by the Chinese. It is an interesting fact that the Japanese forces in Nanking would outnumbered 1 to 7, and they still won the battle. And then they started with a massacre. Now, I hope that the parents will cover the kids' eyes, because what's happened next is rather well documented. As we said, it is the most horrible example of war crimes against civilian population in an occupied territory. They used the people, civilians and military prisoners alike, for target practice, both for shooting and for bayonets. They did something which I have no idea how it works medically, but there are actual video footage of it, so it happened. They forced people to drink kerosene, and then they shot them because they blew up and they made splat, and it was really a lot of fun. They buried people alive up to their necks so they can measure who's going to die faster. They did medical experiments. And overall, in the 6 weeks, 300,000 people died. 50,000 people for one night alone. The sexual crimes that were happening, the sexual violence, was unspeakable. And let us leave it at that. Let us not go into any other details. This is perhaps the most illustrative example of the attitude of the Japanese conquerors towards the Chinese in the conquered area. What you see here is an excerpt from the Japanese papers. These two fine gentlemen here are actually military officers who were competing. Who is going to kill 100 Chinese faster by decapitating them? And the article was published in the sports pages because it was seen as a sports competition. We come to maybe one of the most interesting and unknown stories of World War II. This gentleman here is known as John Robb, and he went down in history as the good Nazi. What was happening? Given the situation in Nanking, which was as bad as it was, the foreigners were quickly withdrawing. Robb was the head of the Nazi party for Asia. And he was living in China for many years. He had friends there. He had good connections with trade. And a lot of people are saying that he wasn't really a real Nazi because he never was in Germany during the Nazi regime. He never got to see how it actually looked like. He was an expat living in Asia and, knowing only from the press what's happening in Germany. But the thing is that when things started going to shit in Nanking, he was horrified. And he went to the mayor of Nanking saying that something had to be done to stop the disaster. And the mayor said, you know what, if you're so eager to stop the disaster, why don't you be the mayor for a while and I'm going to go away? So he ended up as the mayor, and his desperate move to save as many people as he could was to create a safe zone in the houses where the foreigners were living. It was basically a restricted area of the city which had a fence, so every civilian, every military person who managed to reach the safe zone was spared because Raab guaranteed for their life and safety. The problem was, however, that after a while, the Japanese realized what was happening. Now, they couldn't go directly against Raab because the Germans were friends, which basically put him in the position to be able to do all of that in the first place. But on the other hand, they could stop the people from reaching the safe zone. And when Raab realized that the Japanese military was basically obstructing people and by not letting them get to safety, he did something which was absolutely crazy. He took his limo and his personal driver, and he put on his parade Nazi uniform. Full regalia, swastika, Iron Cross, the funny hat, everything. And he started cruising the streets of Nanking by night like some sort of a goddamn Nazi Batman rescuing people, putting them in his car and taking them to safety, to the safe zone. It is estimated that Raab saved around 250,000 people, compared to Oskar Schindler, who saved 1,200. Now, what happened with Raab after the war? He was, of course, tried as a Nazi by the Allied forces, but he was liberated because of the testimonies from people from Nanking who guaranteed that he saved their lives. So, but of course, even though he wasn't convicted, he couldn't really make a living in the post-Nazi Germany. He, in the end, survived because people from China were sending him food and resources. And when he died, the Chinese government asked for his remains to be sent to China. So he's buried in Nanking in the Memorial Center for the Victims. Google the story if you're interested. It's one of the most untold tales of World War II. Now, when we're done with these fun stories, Nanking is down, China is down, Japan is controlling a huge chunk of mainland Asia. And what do? They join a fun club with these fine gentlemen here. Now, it's an interesting situation because Japan still hasn't declared war. They just joined the alliance. But by joining the alliance, they started, celebrating. These are the actual propaganda tools that they were used to mark their big, alliance. And what's perfectly fascinating is when you take a look at the faces here, you see that the Italians and the Germans are actually drawn as Asians. And after joining the party, they got their first military prime minister, Hideki Tojo. Remember this guy, we're going to talk about him a lot later. So when Tojo becoming the first military prime minister, it basically meant that even officially the country was put under military command. What happens then? They did not officially declare war, so they're not part of World War II as of yet. But on behalf of their allies, they carry out certain attacks on Guam, Indochina, the Philippines, Macau, and Hong Kong. At the time, those were the territories controlled by France and the UK. So what happens? Do you remember how Japan was basically living on oil imported from the United States? The United States came and say, you know what, guys, we were okay with giving you oil while you were killing other yellow people, that was fine. But now you started, bombing stuff that you shouldn't bomb, so we're going to have to introduce an embargo, no more oil for you. And the Japanese reaction to that was, ta-da! This was orchestrated by Admiral Yamamoto. We're not going to talk about him because we will need an hour for that. But the important thing to note is that this is the official beginning of the Pacific theater in World War II, because the United States were dragged into the shitstorm. Pacific War colorized. What did it mean? First and foremost, it meant a clash of cultures. On one hand, we have the Allies, mostly the Americans, with a bit of Australians and Canadians, and a couple of UK people who wandered lost there. On the other hand, it's the Japanese. The Japanese wartime strategy, psychology, mentality was based on a very twisted interpretation of samurai-hood and bushido. It is as if they took what they liked out of it without trying to go for the whole idea behind the bushido culture. And based on these cherry-picked facts, they built a super strict, super firm patriotism, which was like a fanatical fanaticism, very fatalist in nature. Which meant that one of the first things they did when they trained their soldiers was how to commit suicide by shooting yourself in the mouth with your rifle and using the thumb on your leg, your toes. Which meant that they weren't afraid to die. There was no surrender. You do not withdraw. You go on until you're standing. And when you fall, you keep fighting. And for the Western culture of warfare, that was a big cultural shock, because what the fuck do you do with the enemy who is not afraid to die? It also resulted in some pretty nightmarish psychological situations. For instance, according to the Geneva Convention, according to the protocols of warfare, you do not kill the wounded. The wounded are the prisoners of war. But the Japanese wounded, what they did, they were lying on the ground pretending to be dead, only to lie on grenades. So when soldiers approached them, they would, blow themselves up and did a lot of damage to everybody else. Which meant that the Allies started to kill the wounded, which left quite a nasty psychological consequence of their complete mental health. And also there was the issue of cruelty in the camps for prisoners of war, because the Japanese could not understand this will to live and to survive at all costs. Real heroes, they kill themselves when they're captured. They do not try to survive. And if you're trying to survive, it must mean that you're a wuss. And if you're a wuss, it's okay to torture you or to treat you however we see fit. So basically, the cruelties in the Japanese camps of prisoners of war are the stuff of nightmares. They're pretty well documented. If you're feeling particularly masochistic, you can look it up. But what this meant is that for a while, Japan was doing really, really good in the Pacific theater. At some point, given that Australia is basically next in line when you take a look at the map, there were serious concerns that they could invade Australia, until this happened. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of World War II on the Pacific theater. Why? Because the Allies understood that in order to win, they have to be merciless. And it was a complete change of perspective in the way they waged war. What is interesting to note is that in the Battle of Midway, Japan lost all the aircrafts and all the pilots that they managed to produce and train in the first 2 years of the war, which put them in a pretty shitty situation and basically created this. Now, do you guys know what is mono no aware? For those who don't, it is basically the the very heart, the very core of the Japanese sense of aesthetics. It means the beauty of fragility, the beauty of impermanence. The symbol of Japanese aesthetics is the cherry blossom. But the cherry blossom withers quickly. It only lasts for a few days before it falls apart and dies. So when you enjoy beauty, part of that enjoyment is the sadness coming out of the fact that you know that it will wither quickly, that beauty is something that will pass. The same goes for how they see youth. They see youth as something that is impermanent, only there temporary, which is why dying young is almost fetishized as such, is seen as something noble and aesthetically beautiful. It is an aesthetic experience in a certain way. So, of course, behind the kamikaze movement, you had some pretty serious military calculations. They figured out that after losing all the experienced pilots in Midway, they had to do something with their air force, but they couldn't produce quality aircrafts quickly, and they couldn't train pilots quickly. So a very clever solution was like, just make an airplane that will fly, and that should be as light as possible so you can fill it in with explosives, and train somebody super quickly. Like, here, this is the steering wheel, this is how you take off. You don't need to learn how to land. We're not going to go there. And it worked. For a while, it really worked because they managed to recruit a lot of people into it. A popular story is that all of them were volunteers, super happy to give their life for their country, etc. Part of it is true. The Japanese brainwashed youth was really into all this strict patriotic stuff so that they could sell them the story. But from another point of view, there was a lot of social pressure and social games there. For instance, when you were enlisting into kamikaze, you had to fill in a questionnaire. The only answers were yes and no, and you had to sign it. And if you say no, it's like shame on you, and shame on your family, and shame on your cow. And we know where your father works, and we know where your mother goes grocery shopping. So a lot of them enlisted because that was the only way to protect their families. On the other hand, there was a very famous case of a guy who said no on the questionnaire only to find his own name on the list of kamikaze the next day. Why? Because his superior at the military academy was too ashamed to admit that he had the one guy saying no, so he said, yeah, they all want to go. They were very, very young. Average age was between 15 and 20. Of course, some of their superior officers were there too because they were trying to show with their own example what is the true act of patriotism. But on average, they were so very young, and their death was seen as something not only noble, not only patriotic, but also beautiful. In this mono no avara sense, it was almost seen as a human sacrifice in a way. And what we have here are two very famous photos. One is this... Okay. One is this guy with a puppy. It was shot on his 17th birthday, and he died the next day. And the other is a kamikaze decorated with sakura blossoms that were symbolizing the Japanese aesthetics in the kamikaze movement. Now, did the tactic work? To an extent, it did, because, of course, everybody was afraid of the kamikaze. The people were, crazy enough to do something like that. That's an enemy you don't want to joke around with. But to another extent, not really, because the Japanese kept losing battles in World War II. These are the crucial two battles for the end of the war. One was Iwo Jima. I think that nowadays it's mostly known for the Clint Eastwood movies and how they faked the rising of the flag. And the second is the Battle of Okinawa, which lasted for several months, and it was called Tetsu no Ame, or the Rain of Steel, seen as, even today, the biggest Navy battle of all times. Fun fact, statistics. Do you know how many Japanese defenders died on Iwo Jima? 99%. On Okinawa, 94%. And that is the lowest casualty rate of the Japanese in a battle in World War II. Yay. So, basically, this puts Japan in a situation when it's about to be flattened to the ground. We are in July of 1945. What we have is that Japan is the only country still playing. It's game over for Italy and Germany for a while already. We have Tokyo carpet bombings, which started in March and which were so intense that basically in Tokyo you had only like black fields of scorched earth whenever you looked. We have a very difficult forecast of a possible land invasion because somebody did an analysis based on the Japanese behavior in the Navy battles, how that would look like. And the conclusion was that if they proceed with the invasion from Okinawa, which they conquered and which was a good entry point to all 4 islands, they would, it would cost them around 200,000 Allied soldiers and 20 million Japanese. So those were the statistical forecasts for casualties. So that was not an option. They offered the Potsdam Declaration, that was the peace offering to Japan in July 1945. Hirohito's brother actually tried to convince him to sign it because the land was in a pretty desperate situation. Tojo, the general who was the prime minister, had a very diplomatic answer to this Potsdam Declaration, that was fuck off. So the war continued, and the Allies had a couple of options. One was to proceed with the land invasion, fuck the casualties. The other was to see what the USSR is going to do, because back then Germany had it done with the Soviets, and Comrade Stalin started, turning his eye towards Asia and going like, looky, and what can we do here if we continue with our invasions? You guys took Manchuria? Oh, well, how interesting. And the third option was to try out their new toy. And of course, trying out a new toy is the most interesting idea. That's the A-bomb. Above, we see Enola Gay. That is the airplane that carried the first Hiroshima bomb, the little boy. And below is an example of the headlines from the American newspapers in 1945. What I particularly like is how gloriously politically incorrect it is. How they don't give a shit about what they're saying. But about the A-bomb, what happens is that first to go was Hiroshima. 2 cities were selected from a list. Hiroshima and Kokura. Why these 2? Because bombing Tokyo wouldn't serve any purpose any longer. They bombed the hell out of it. There was no point in continuing. Because they had military industry, because they had strategic importance, and because it was assessed that with the number of population, they could hit these cities without having too many casualties. So that was the assessment. Hiroshima was struck on August 6, 1945. This is the actual mushroom cloud. And as you see, it's pretty obvious now why they're using the Arizona photo, because it's much prettier. This one looks like a fart. The reason why Kokura was selected was not to take Kyoto into account. And you know why Kyoto was taken off the list? Because the American admiral who was involved in the selection of the city spent his honeymoon there, and he really liked the city, and he really didn't feel like, blowing it to the ground. So the turn came to Kokura. There is an expression in Japanese language, Kokura luck. What does it mean? The weather was so cloudy over Kokura that they couldn't have a visual confirmation of the target. So they couldn't drop the bomb. And they didn't know what to do. So they kept flying The bomb was named Fat Man. By the way, both names, Little Boy and Fat Man, come from the movie The Maltese Falcon. They kept flying, but there was a problem with the Fat Man because one of the metal cables holding the bomb loosened. So basically, landing the plane with a loosened A-bomb was a tricky thing to do. So they had to get rid of it ASAP. And they were like, oh, hey, there's a city down there. What's the name of the city? Nagasaki. It'll do. This is how it happened. What was semi-good for Nagasaki was that they didn't hit the city directly, like Hiroshima, which was hit in the city center. They hit it in the suburbs. And the bomb exploded above the city, not in the city, which meant that the overall damage was around 60% lower than in Hiroshima. And that is the reason why the majority of bomb-related stories and events are about Hiroshima, not about Nagasaki that much. But at least the cloud is prettier. The picture of the mushroom is better. So, what happens? Fun facts. We can proceed with pictures of Hiroshima. 120,000 people died in Hiroshima. 40,000 people died in Nagasaki. Add these two numbers, and it's less people than in Nanking. Add these two numbers, and it's less people than in the carpet bombings of Tokyo in March that year. So why is it then so brutal? Why is it then so scary? This is the famous picture of the torii, which remained standing despite the bombing, and nowadays it's seen as one of the symbols of the city. This is how it looked like. Here you have examples of radiation burns and radiation victims. This is basically a direct victim from the blast. And a lady who was wearing a kimono, and the pattern on her kimono got transferred to the skin from the radiation blast. These are the radiation burns, like random radiation burns. And above you see an interesting comparison. Like you can choose to, or you cannot choose. You can end up in a situation when you die quickly by having your flesh melt off your bones, or you can die slowly and miserably by having your clothes melt on your flesh. And there was also a pretty big issue with blindness as one of the biggest health-related problems. There was a huge problem with the so-called black rain, which kept falling for days, returning the radiation levels, making it impossible for the air and the wind to clear the situation a little bit. People were losing hair, people were having bloody diarrhea. There was a whole array of horrible health consequences. So when you take a look at the situation from that point of view, even if the casualties are not so big, like in some other situations, the psychological effect is horrible. All this was done by 1 or 2 bombs in 2 days in 15 minutes. So the question may be also why this wasn't prohibited immediately. You had those horrible military poison gas used in World War I, which was immediately banned after the war, and this wasn't. The reasoning behind this was that as long as there is weapons like this in the world, the big forces will hesitate to declare war, because this can be used. Now, will that happen? Won't it happen? We don't know. But it was quite enough for Japan to finally surrender. So we have Hirohito's surrender speech in August 15, 1945. It was the first time that the Japanese emperor talked to the audience, talked to his people on the radio. So basically the first time they heard the emperor's voice was for the emperor to tell them that he's fucked. His reason for surrender was the quote that if the war keeps going, that will be the end of human civilization as we know it. Sounds nice and very quotable. He also admitted that he is not a descendant of the sun goddess, but a mere mortal. And basically that is seen as the end of this military era Japan. and the official end of World War II. Of course, we have the aftermath. We have the Tokyo trials. That was the set of trials against the war criminals that were responsible for the role of Japan in World War II. This is Hideki Tojo being tried with the headphones for interpretation. Now, there were 3 classes of criminals. Class A, those who were actually having a command responsibility for what was happening, and Class B and C, those who were actually committing the crimes. Class B and C was very easy to prove, because like you talk shit, get hit, you were caught red-handed killing the Chinese, yes, you got to suffer the consequences. Around 5,700 military officers were tried and sanctioned in some way. A lot of them were hanged for crimes against humanity based on Class B and C war indictments. Among them were those 2 gentlemen from the sports pages. Do you know what was their defense? Well, we didn't really kill 100 Chinese, only 70. But what to do with Class A criminals? Because this is not Germany. In Germany, you had those very direct laws that were racist laws, that were basically a way for the state legalization of crime. And you had concrete signatures. You had a very clear chain of command. You didn't have something like that in Japan. Class A criminals were people who were just in the position of power while war crimes were happening. There were no proof that they ordered the war crimes to happen. And the indictment was based on some things that were not known in the international law until then, and that is that they were guilty not for action, for doing things, but for the so-called non-action. You sat on your ass where people were doing that in Nanking, so you're guilty. And that also meant that as the military prime minister, Hideki Tojo was sentenced to death. And that also meant that because these A-class criminals couldn't be tried for concrete crimes, the Japanese perception of the Tokyo trials was seeing it as vindicative winner's justice, not as actual facing with your crimes in the war, not as actual moment of reconciliation. And then we have this guy here, Douglas MacArthur, the shogun, as they call him. He was the American overseer of the occupation of Japan, and he was a great guy. He was really super interesting. He liked to talk about himself in third person and to act talking, and it was super weird to observe him speaking, but anyway, he understood the Japanese mentality very well, and he introduced some short-term measures that allowed a very smooth transition in Japan. One was that nobody from the imperial family will suffer any consequences for anything they did in the war. Now, one could argue that Hirohito wasn't in the position to actually do anything. But you had nice people in the imperial family, such as Prince Asaoka, who was directly involved in the Nanking massacre, and nothing happened to him. The second thing that he did was that he insisted that Hirohito should remain in power. Hirohito wanted to abdicate, give the position to his son, but he said that no, you're defeated, and you are going to stay here as a defeated emperor. This is how we're going to change the mentality of the nation. They should know that it's possible to lose and to stay there. And what is also something that is credited to him is that he insisted on keeping the dignity of the people who were found guilty in the Tokyo trials. This is why you will not find any footage or photos of the executions, because he personally prohibited any of that. So thanks to the shogun, it was very easy for Japan to turn into this. What happens in the late 40s and the 1950s? You have USSR going crazy. You have communist China. You have things starting to brew in Korea, in Vietnam. And you have the United States of America needing an urgent ally in Asia who's going to be friendly, who's going to do what he's told, and who will allow them to build military bases. And therefore, all of a sudden, the rhetorics around Japan turned, and all of a sudden Japan became a friendly nation. And what is particularly interesting, which will leave consequences, is that the Tokyo trials were stopped. Out of 40 A-class war criminals that were indicted, you know how many were convicted? 7. And the rest was stopped. So on one hand, it's a great short-term victory because when you look at Japan, everything goes very well. They have reformed. They're American friends now. On the other hand, not going as thoroughly with this denazification process, let's call it like that, as they did in Germany, left some serious consequences on the society. What are the actual consequences that we can see nowadays? One is that the Japanese constitution outlaws war. They're the only nation in the world that specifically prohibits war as a means to settle international disputes. Also, Japan has no army. It only has the self-defense forces. Now, that's bullshit. The self-defense forces are the army. It's just they're not called the army. But given the power of symbols, let's say that some people in Japan are very upset that they can't be called the army. Apart from that, in particular, in the first years after the war, Japan started getting a very prominent role in the United Nations, in all the peacekeeping efforts, in the environmental efforts, in the anti-nuclear weapons, Fukushima, but let us not go there now. And we have concluded with the historical part. We can begin with the epic boom of Akira. The whole Japanese pop culture came out of World War II. That's not an exaggeration. Basically, their storytelling tropes and topics are very relevant to what happened in World War II. Here are some of the common themes that you will find in many anime and manga. Abuse of technology, death and rebirth, as a cycle, as a phoenix, orphans and mutants, post-apocalyptic dystopia, let us save the environment, and of course my very favorite, teenagers sent to war by adults, also known as Shinji get in the fucking robot. Now, before we start talking about some examples of World War II in the Japanese pop culture, let's just say that we will focus on the works that are specifically related to World War II. So not about the themes overall, but concrete portrayals of World War II. I don't know if you heard about this. If you haven't, look it up. It's on YouTube. It's called Momotaro's Divan Sea Warriors. It is the first long animated movie ever produced in Japan, and it is used as military propaganda. Basically, you have the story about Momotaro trying to save Asia from the Asians. And as the symbol of Japan, Momotaro is uniting all the Asian animals to fight together. So you have these absolutely surreal moments of bunny rabbits and puppies and kitties wearing Nippon Banzai wraps and, shooting on Schmeissers and stuff like that. And on one hand, it's hilarious, it's sad, it's heartbreaking to know that so many great artistic ideas went to this. It's also heartbreaking to know how this propaganda ended, and it's something that, if you're interested in the phenomenology of pop culture, you should definitely take a look at. Then, of course, we have Gojira. The longest movie franchise in the world is directly related to World War II because, as the story goes, the bomb woke up a prehistorical kaiju or a big monster living at the sea bottom that then went and destroyed Tokyo. It's a long history of, people in rubber suits walking like this, destroying, dioramas. But it also produced some absolutely unbelievable masterpieces, such as Godzilla against King Kong, or Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. It can be seen seen as something that is just for fun, but it can also be seen as a very good indicator about where is Japanese society at the moment. Because depending on how Godzilla is portrayed, whether he is a destructive force there to destroy Tokyo, or as a helping force there to save Tokyo from a worse kaiju, you can pretty much see the mentality of the society and how it's going. Of course, it was rebooted and remade by the Americans. The first Godzilla from the 1998, I think, where it looked like a T-Rex because Jurassic Park was everywhere, and then the new Godzilla franchise where it actually looked like a Godzilla, and they promised that he will also fight King Kong because fuck it. But okay. Anyway, if you're interested in new takes on Godzilla, a recommendation is to look up the Japanese reboot from 2016, which was directed by Hideaki Anno, or the author of Evangelion. Yes, he made it depressing. Then we have Osamu Tezuka. Basically, Tezuka's entire work is heavily influenced by World War II. You have stuff like The Phoenix, which is his life's work, where he developed so many different topics about mankind and civilization, combining historical episodes with futuristic sci-fi and fantasy episodes. You have stuff like Mu, which is direct criticism of the American occupation of Japan, but you also have his more obvious World War II manga, such as the famous Adolf, the story of three people with the name Adolf. One is a German boy who very quickly becomes victim of propaganda and develops all the, quirks of a proper Hitlerjugend little boy. The other is a Jewish boy named Adolf, who used to be best friends with the other Adolf, but then shit hit the fan. And the third is, the Adolf. What is interesting is that the manga begins in the 1940s and then in the 1960s with the Israeli-Palestinian war and deals with the issue of Jewish identity written by a Japanese. It's very, very interesting. His other work is maybe more directly related to Japan, that is Ayako. It treats the Japanese mentality with regard to surviving soldiers. The story is about a guy who survived the war and came back to his hometown, which is like a village in the middle of nowhere, where he was shunned. Instead of being welcomed as a hero, they are ashamed of him. He's a family embarrassment because heroes died, patriots died, and you came back. Shame on you from coming back. And through his very weird relationship with his not too much younger niece, which is the Ayako from the title, we get to explore what it means to come back as a survivor in the Japanese society after the war. It's controversial, especially given the relationship between uncle and niece, but it also has some high-quality psychological input. You have probably heard about this one, Space Battleship Yamato, a huge franchise by Leiji Matsumoto, which basically dominated the 70s in the Japanese pop culture. You know the real story about the Yamato ship. It was built as the pride and joy of the Japanese Navy, the biggest ship ever to float, the floating fortress as they called it, and during the Battle of Okinawa, which we already mentioned as one of the crucial ones in the last years of the Pacific War, the thing is that Yamato had a mission. The mission was to reach the beach of Okinawa, get stranded there, and serve as a fortress, stopping the Americans from reaching the beach. They sunk the ship before it managed to reach Okinawa, and it was found only recently, actually, on the bottom of the sea. However, it remained a legend in the Japanese war stories. And the story of Space Battleship Yamato is that in the far future, you have aliens bombing the Earth with nuclear weapons. And they dig out the wreck of the old Yamato and turn it into a spaceship that will go to find the solution to save Earth. So basically, Japanese World War II ship is saving Earth from nuclear bombing, and yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a very resilient franchise. It had a live action in 2010, which was really well made. Then it had an OVA reboot from 2012, which managed to modernize the story for the new generation of audiences. It was really well done. If you are curious, this is the one that I would recommend. Then we have Barefoot Gen. I think that you have to know about this. It is based on the biographical manga of Kenji Nakazawa. He survived the Hiroshima bombing. And you know how he survived? He dropped a marble that fell on the ground. And he crouched to get the marble. And when the radiation blast hit, he was behind a low wall. So the wall stopped the blast from, just picking him up. And he watched the girl standing in front of him basically losing the upper half of her body because the blast went like that, and the legs that were preserved thanks to the wall just fell in front of him. And he transformed his experience into a manga, which was then adapted as an anime movie. Now, the anime movie is not really perfect. There's budget issues, and there's the famous issue of bad voice acting if you're listening to it in Japanese. They wanted to be more realistic, and they hired child voice actors for the main roles, but the problem was that the kids did the job the best they could, but they thought that by shouting louder, they're more dramatic, so sometimes it's a bit difficult to go through the entire movie. But you don't watch the movie for the children's adventure, you watch the movie for this. It has the most famous scene of the Hiroshima blast. It lasts for almost 5 minutes, and it's beautifully animated, abstract death and destruction in slow motion. People die, children die, babies die, animals die, buildings get blown up. And the very fact that it is animated gives it a sense of abstraction. So even though it is horrible, it's just horrible enough for you to get a very clear picture of how it looked like in real life, but without turning into like a gore fest, which it would have been if it were live action. And I remember we were organizing a screening in Serbia of this once, and when the scene came, the silence was like tomb silence in the hall, and people were shaking and crying afterwards when the movie ended. And if you want to talk about the horrors of nuclear wars, don't tell them history, just show them this. There's also the aftermath of people dying of hunger, people, walking around like zombies with shards in their backs that they can't feel because they don't feel any pain because of the nuclear blast. It's pretty an experience, let us put it that way. And definitely one of the most powerful examples of World War II portrayed in Japanese pop culture. Then I'm sure that you know about this one. It is made by Isao Takahata from Studio Ghibli, also known as the one who is not Hayao Miyazaki. It was produced so that it can be shown in the movies back to back with My Neighbor Totoro. So one is a fluffy fairy tale about a children's imaginary friend living in the forest, and the other is this. It is about a brother and a sister dying of hunger in 1945. Fun fact, in 1945 they had the worst harvest in Japan since 1902. And the problem was that not only they were losing the war, not only they were bombed, but they were also hungry. They couldn't produce food, they couldn't import food. This is the movie dealing with the consequences. And it is beautiful, the direction is amazing, some of the animation solutions are really brilliant with their creativity, especially the very famous Fireflies scene. But there is something that not a lot of people in the West know, because here, when we watch it in the West, we see it as a heartbreaking tale of two kids dying of hunger and anti-war tragic tale meant to make us cry. In an interview, Takahata said that this is the wrong interpretation of the movie. We're not supposed to sympathize with the boy. We're supposed to think he's an idiot. He could have apologized to his aunt. He could have, bowed his back and accept her conditions and survive, but he didn't. He insisted on, I can do it by myself, I can survive, I can, save my sister, and we know how it ended. And he said that the boy is a symbol of Imperial Japan not wanting to surrender. You're not supposed to feel sorry, you're supposed to think he's wrong. The cockpit is another example of Leiji Matsumoto's works, far less known than his Yamato series. It's a three-piece OVA, mostly made to blow the budget on animating all the dogfights in the air. First episode is dealing with a German air pilot, maybe the least interesting of the three. Second is about a day in the kamikaze's life before he goes to the mission. And the third is our squad in the Philippine war zone, who encounters a young message carrier coming to him with the new orders, and it's a 14-year-old boy, and the guy becomes obsessed with his mission to save the boy, to help the boy make it out alive from the war zone. And it has a very disturbing scene, because at some point you hear people dying, you hear people screaming, and he's looking on ants on the ground, and he feeds a butterfly to the ants. And while people scream in the background, you watch animated ants picking apart the butterfly. It's a very, very powerful moment. Here we are entering interesting territories. This is not a very well-known manga and anime outside of Japan, but in Japan it was rather big, Zipang. The story is about a military exercise by the self-defense forces, which are totally not the army. And they go through a vortex in time because of a sea storm, ending up in the middle of the Battle of Midway. And we know how important the Battle of Midway is for World War II. So, there is this temptation. What do you do when you know that your country is supposed to lose the crucial battle? Are you going to sit aside and, twiddle your thumbs, or are you going to do something to push things a little bit? On one hand, it is a very interesting moral drama, because it plays on the idea, are you allowed to change the past? On the other hand, this is the first moment when you start having the war shown in a vacuum. It's an abstract war happening, and it's an abstract dilemma what to do. It is not mentioned what the Japanese are doing and how are they waging war and on whose side. Why am I using this as an example? It's probably one of my favorite examples of World War II in Japanese pop culture. First, I am a bit old school. I'm an old lady, I can be old school, and I think that the first Full Metal Alchemist was way better than Brotherhood. I know that a lot of people believe that Brotherhood is the superior version because it follows the manga, but I prefer my character drama and historical trivia than action and shonen and humor. So, fuck you. Why The Conqueror of Shambhala? Because it features a very interesting scene. Now, I'm not talking about animated Hitler and his failure to capture Munich in the 20s. No, that's not it, although it's a very fun thing to watch. I'm talking about a very peculiar moment when Edward Elric is talking to Fritz Lang, a historical character who was a very famous German silent movie director. Absolutely brilliant director. He introduced so many modern tropes and ways of storytelling that he basically shaped the modern cinematography, and we don't know it to what extent. And he's talking to Fritz Lang, and Fritz Lang says that all these funny ideas that the Germans got about, one country, one nation, racial purity, etc., etc., they come from a German traveler who was traveling around Japan and who was delighted to see the Japanese idea about nationalism and purity and ethnocentricity, etc. And out of all examples of World War II in pop culture, including some, highly regarded live-action movies, this is the closest I've ever seen to the Japanese saying, well, we fucked up. And that makes it quite remarkable. the conqueror of Shambhala of all things, ladies and gents. Now, this is a very sad story. And why is this a very sad story? I guess that most of you haven't even heard about this one, right? You have, yeah. Nitrate 1931 is a spy story dealing with Shanghai internal politics before the Mukden incident and the entire Manchuria clusterfuck. And it follows a group of superpowered spies working for Japan. It was created as part of an anime no Chikara project, which was aiming to start producing anime targeted to a slightly older audience and stuff which is not based on manga or games, but original content. The problem was that they went a bit too far when some things are concerned. So yeah, it's an interesting story of character development concerning the spies, because basically you watch them break down and lose their ideals, and by the end they're either dead or they gave up or they're living miserable and lonely. But the main problem was that the Mukden incident from 1931 is here clearly shown as a Japanese conspiracy. And that cost them a lot, because when it was clear that they're going to go with the admission of guilt, saying in the famous episode 7, yep, the Japanese blew up the railway, that meant that the moment the extreme right wing in Japan discovered that, they started a horrible campaign against the series. They threatened the producer, the director, the voice actors. They threatened the families of the animators. They blackmailed the TV channel that was supposed to air this. It was a very, very bad moment on the Japanese internet back then. And in the end, they did buckle down. They never aired episode 7 on TV. It was only shown on the internet. And the consequence of this was so grave that the entire network suffered a huge financial blow because the series ended up a total dud. And they closed the project. So it's a dark, dark episode in how political views can impact this kind of things. And then we have this. It's a very dangerous example. And I'm going to explain why. We go back to stories that we started talking about with Zipang, how war is portrayed in a vacuum. This is an ephemeral series from 2016, best known because it was voted the second most popular series of the year among the female audience. The first was Yuri on Ice. Why? Because you have a bunch of pretty boys who are Japanese spies, spying for Japan in the 1930s and collecting intelligence all over the country to, promote their country's ideals and to support the war and the cause. The war is never analyzed as such. Again, it is an abstract war happening somewhere in the vacuum, and you are watching a bunch of super hot dudes going through what is called as a genre competence porn, like Kaiji and Akagi and that kind of mind game anime where you're supposed to, outwit the opponent and to show how smart you are, and it's like mind games and battles. So it is kind of fun because it's about mind games, but on the other hand, the events are taking place 3 months from Nanking. It's never mentioned. The war is in the vacuum, and we're cheering for our pretty boys to get the intelligence we need. And we have shit like this. This is a known cry-jerker movie. It is heavily drawn on Kenji Miyazawa's Night on the Galactic Railroad, which is one of the biggest classics of the Japanese literature. It is basically those movies that are emotionally manipulative because they know exactly what buttons to press to make you cry? It is pressing every button by the book, as if it's following a manual. So I know a lot of people who like it a lot and who were diligently crying on every scene that when they were supposed to cry. And it is about Japanese family having to leave Asia, where the boys grew up, where they spent their beautiful childhood, and having to return to Japan as refugees because, you know, Japan lost and now they have to leave these territories and live in refugee camps, and it's all so horrible and it's all so sad. But they're never asking the question, which is basically the whole point of the situation, like, yes, okay, we get it. You had to leave Manchuria, but what the fuck were you doing in Manchuria in the first place? And it's super sad, and it's, from a message point of view, highly problematic. And then we have this. Now, I honestly want to believe that Hetalia was made with a pure heart. And they didn't have any, you know, evil intentions with this, and that it was not made as a propaganda. But we're talking about a harmless, toothless, funny, cutesy, ditzy, moe portrayal of the Axis forces in the World War II. Please note how Germany is not in the Nazi uniform, it's Wehrmacht uniform. Please note that there's no swastika in the background, but the German flag. It's so, like, it's so cute and sweet and so innocent, and yeah, it makes you totally forget how the three fine gentlemen from the special club really looked like. And all you see is the, Axis powers holding hand, wishing for world peace, like on a, Miss Universe competition. And I know a lot of people really like Italia. It's cute. Sometimes it can be really cute. I think that it has the best analysis of the complicated relationship between Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus that I know. But also the way it takes the edge out of some very nasty shit that we've seen and we talked about, and how it portrays it as so cute and funny. Let me say that I can kind of understand the Chinese for being a bit pissed about it. But this is not the worst. I think that the most, alarming example of becoming, a cutesy, ditzy Morschlock is, ta-da! This shit here is based on a browser game where you're supposed to collect Gijinka, or humanized versions of the most famous ships from World War II. And each ship is redesigned and portrayed as your fuckable moe waifu. As you can see. So, these are the ships that you can collect. And you can have the pillow, and you can do stuff with your pillow. And that is Yamato. Now, I'm going to go back because I can't stand to look at this. But perhaps this is the most alarming example of how things are going down the slippery slope, or forgetting the nasty stuff and ending with the fuckable waifu version of your Japanese World War II fleet. I saved my favorite example for the very end. I hope that you have heard about this and that you have watched it. It is the only TV project of my very favorite anime movie director, that is Satoshi Kon, who sadly passed away in 2010. And if you ask me, the 2010 and his death is the moment in time that marks when anime started going to shit. But as I said, I'm an old lady and I can have opinions. And the story of the paranoia agent is actually pretty simple. You have a maniac who is having rollerblades and who is having a baseball bat, and he's going around Tokyo beating up people, and people end up in hospital. At first glance, it's pretty, simple and not much to tell the story about. But then you start discovering things about the people who ended up in hospital, because at first glance, they have nothing in common. But as you learn more about them, you realize that they were all in a very similar moment in life. They were cornered. They were in a situation where they didn't like their life, when they had to make decisions they didn't feel like making, when they were about to be debunked or, exposed or having to go through a very unpleasant moment at work. And then there's a maniac who comes up and who beats the shit out of them, and they end up in hospital, and all of a sudden, they no longer have to deal with all the unpleasant life-related stuff, they're victims. And everybody comes to them and say, oh, poor you, you're such a victim, you got beaten up by a maniac. And why is this important? Because when you discuss Paranoia Agent and when you read interviews with Satoshi Kon, it is the story of Japan and World War II. It is the story of how, by embracing our victimhood, because we got hit by the bomb, we can avoid taking responsibility for any of the nasty shit that we did during the war. It is the story about closing our eyes because the kawaii culture that directly mutated out of the post-World War II cultural scene is the thing that is sort of providing too much escapism for the current generations in Japan to be able to face some of the darker sides of the history. And it is essentially the story of how they learned to love the bomb, or how by refusing to face certain issues, you can have, and by portraying those times in a vacuum, and we saw how the portrayal changed over time, you can have a culture in which the role of Japan in World War II can be denied. Now, we know that in Europe, denying Holocaust is a criminal offense. You suffer serious consequences for that. There's no such a thing in Japan. The revisionism that took place was gradual, and it was largely started by the fact that denazification was never done properly, that MacArthur's measures were only short-term, and empowered by the current trends in pop culture. Because if you can fuck a boat from World War II, it must be that there was no war crimes involved, because who's going to think about war crimes? The Yasukuni Shrine is one of the most controversial places in Japan because it is a Shinto shrine to military deities where you have the names of all the important warriors in Japanese history enshrined there, meaning that there's some kind of a saint. And the prime minister is going there once a year to bow to the ancestors, let's say it like that. The problem is that gradually, people who were directly tried at the Tokyo trials became enshrined in the Yasukuni Shrine, including Hideki Tojo in 1962. Which means that every time the Japanese prime minister is going there to bow to the shadows of the ancestors, he is sort of paying respects to people who are convicted war criminals, which is putting Japan in a very nasty diplomatic situation. Now, Japan apologized, yes. It paid some war damages, yes. But they never really accepted full responsibility. In the Japanese history books in schools, the Nanking Massacre is portrayed as an internal Chinese conflict where the Chinese were killing other Chinese and the Japanese were there to introduce order and peace. The sexual violence is seen as entrepreneurship, and the ladies are portrayed as sex workers who were actually earning for a living that way. And all of that resulted in this. This is actually a very interesting website called Japanese Propaganda and Kimono Fabrics. I have to say they have beautiful kimono fabrics. But there is a lot of very strong far-right propaganda negating that any of the Japanese war crimes in World War II ever happened. And that is possible because the victimhood from the bomb allowed them to dilute their own perception of their role in World War II. And that is, I think, a message that we should all consider. So, thank you for your attention.